The neighborhood had always seemed quiet, perfectly ordinary on the surface, the kind of suburban development that promised peace, well-kept lawns and carefully written rules tucked inside the HOA's handbook. On weekends, children played in cul-de-sacs, families barbecued in their fenced yards, and neighbors gave polite waves as they drove by. But beneath that perfectly manicured calm, tensions always simmered, waiting for something, or someone, to ignite them. For months, I had lived in relative peace, watching the chaos of the HOA unfold from a distance. As police chief, I was used to handling disputes far more serious than the petty complaints and whispered gossip that floated around our streets. I preferred to stay out of the politics, letting the board and their self-appointed queen, the woman everyone knew as Karen, manage their little kingdom. But that was before the day her son decided that my car, a restored classic Mustang, should belong to him. The Mustang was my pride and joy, a deep blue beauty I had restored with my own hands. Every Saturday morning, I could be found in the driveway polishing chrome, fine-tuning the engine, and watching as neighbors strolled past with curious glances. It was more than a car. It was history, memory, and hours of dedication wrapped in steel and leather. Most people respected it, admired it, even asked questions about its restoration. But not Karen's teenage son. From the moment he first saw it, he became obsessed. He lingered on the sidewalk, circling like a hawk, asking questions in a tone that was more demand than curiosity. Soon he started showing up uninvited, tugging at the handle, pressing his face against the glass, and insisting that his mother could make a deal for it. At first I brushed it off. Kids get fixated on things. But soon, the behavior escalated. The boy began leaving notes on my windshield, scribbled, with phrases like, "When can I take it for a drive, Day?" and "Mom says we can work this out." I ignored them, tossing them into the trash, but I noticed Karen watching from across the street with her arms folded, her eyes narrowed, as if she were already preparing for a battle. It wasn't long before the whispers began spreading through the neighborhood. According to the gossip chain, Karen had been telling people that my Mustang was too flashy for our community and that I should consider selling it to someone more deserving, her son, naturally. She claimed that a responsible young man should inherit something so valuable and that I was being selfish for keeping it. Most neighbors rolled their eyes at her usual theatrics, but I could sense the storm brewing. The tipping point came on a humid summer evening. I had just finished a long day at the station, parked the Mustang in the driveway, and gone inside. Minutes later, I heard the faint sound of a car alarm. Rushing back outside, I found her son leaning against the driver's side door, tugging at the handle with both hands, as if brute force would grant him ownership. The alarm screamed, lights flashed, and he only looked up with frustration rather than guilt. That was when Karen came striding across the street, phone in hand, fury in her eyes. She didn't apologize for her son's behavior, didn't acknowledge the clear violation of property. Instead, she leveled a finger at me and declared that she was calling the police because I was harassing her son and refusing a fair deal. Her voice carried down the street, echoing through the quiet evening, drawing curious faces to windows and porches. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so absurd. Here she was, dialing 911, summoning officers to my home, not realizing that the man she was targeting, the one she accused of being unreasonable, selfish, and even dang, Iris, was the very person who oversaw the department she was attempting to weaponize. As her son continued to circle the Mustang, muttering under his breath, Karen paced on the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear, her voice rising with every sentence. She painted herself as the victim, a mother standing up for her child, while twisting the narrative into something that barely resembled reality. And as she did, neighbors leaned closer, whispering among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief. I stood there silently, arms folded, waiting. I knew exactly what would happen when the patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood. I knew the look on her face would change when she realized who she had been trying to report. But more than that, I knew this was no longer just about a car. It was about power, control, and the lengths one entitled neighbor was willing to go to get what she wanted. When the sirens grew faint in the distance, the tension on the street thickened. Lights flickered on in houses, dogs barked, and Karen straightened her posture as if preparing to take a victory lap. She had no idea that her attempt to humiliate me would backfire in the most public way possible. And as the patrol car turned the corner and slowed to a stop in front of my driveway, I caught the eyes of the neighbors watching from across the street. Some smirked knowingly, others simply waited, eager for the spectacle that was about to unfold. Karen was about to discover the one truth she had never considered. Not all battles can be won by yelling the loudest. The story of the Mustang had only just begun. Chapter 2 will reveal what happened when the officers stepped out of the patrol car, and Karen realized exactly who she had called. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the quiet cul-de-sac, bouncing off car windows and casting jagged shadows across perfectly trimmed lawns. The patrol car slowed to a crawl, stopping directly in front of my driveway, its engine humming steadily in the humid night. The moment the vehicle appeared, Karen straightened like a performer taking center stage. She smoothed her shirt, lifted her chin, and clutched her phone with exaggerated importance, ready to play the role of the righteous mother demanding justice. Her son, still hovering dangerously close to my Mustang, perked up as if reinforcements had finally arrived to validate his obsession. He gave me a smug look, as though convinced that at any moment the officers would order me to hand over the keys. It was entitlement at its rawest form, the certainty that shouting, demanding, and twisting the truth would bend the world in his favor. Neighbors leaned further out of their doorways, some clutching mugs of coffee or glasses of wine, their faces lit by the alternating glow of the sirens. For them, this was better than television. A live HOA drama unfolding right on their doorstep. Some already whispered predictions, that Karen would berate the officers, that her son would play the victim, that I would refuse to back down. What they didn't know was that the real twist was still waiting to strike. The driver's door opened, and Officer Daniels stepped out, his boots crunching against the pavement. He was one of my most reliable men, someone who had worked alongside me for years. He adjusted his belt, glanced around, and then his eyes landed on me. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face. After all, why had his chief's address popped up on a 911 call? But protocol demanded neutrality, and so he approached cautiously, his expression a practiced mask. Karen wasted no time. She rushed forward, gesturing wildly toward me and the Mustang. Her voice rose in pitch and volume, echoing across the block as she wove her story. She claimed that I had been threatening her son, that I was refusing a community-appropriate arrangement, and that the car was an unsafe distraction in a family-friendly neighborhood. She even sprinkled in dramatic phrases like emotional distress and fear for our safety, as though rehearsed from a television courtroom drama. Her son nodded vigorously at every word, scowling at me with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him. He insisted that I had promised him a ride, that I was reneging on some phantom deal, and that his mother had every right to demand the car be transferred. It was a spectacle of entitlement, each word more exaggerated than the last. Through it all, I remained silent, leaning against the hood of the Mustang, arms crossed. I let the performance play out, let the theatrics run their course, because I knew the moment of revelation was drawing closer. And when it arrived, no amount of shouting would undo it. Officer Daniels listened with the patience of a man used to sifting through noise to find a shred of truth. He nodded politely, jotting something down in his notebook, though his expression betrayed nothing. When Karen finally paused for breath, Daniels turned toward me. His eyes flickered with professional caution, but beneath that, I could see the recognition, the awareness of who I was and what this situation truly represented. He cleared his throat and asked me, in the most neutral tone possible, if I had anything to add. That was when I straightened, stepped away from the Mustang, and gave him a small, knowing smile. The neighbors leaned closer. Karen's eyes narrowed, expecting me to explode in anger, to defend myself with the same theatrical volume she had used. Instead, I simply said the words that shifted the entire street's atmosphere. "I believe you already know who I am." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Daniels blinked once, then twice, before his shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. His lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. He gave a short nod, one only I could fully interpret, before responding in a tone that carried far more respect than neutrality. "Yes, I do." The reaction was instant. Gasps from the crowd of neighbors, widened eyes, murmurs rippling through the gathering like a wave. Karen's confident smirk froze in place, her face draining of color as though she had just realized she had stepped into a trap of her own making. Her son's bravado faltered, his mouth opening and closing without words, confusion painted across his face. Karen stammered, trying to recover, her voice cracking as she insisted that it didn't matter who I was, that the rules of the community applied to everyone. She tried to regain footing, shifting the narrative, but the damage was already done. The authority she had hoped to wield through her 911 call had backfired spectacularly. Instead of officers rallying to her side, she had revealed herself as the instigator, the exaggerator, the entitled neighbor crying wolf in front of the entire street. Officer Daniels remained professional, but his clipped responses carried a weight Karen could not ignore. He reminded her that making false or exaggerated reports was a misuse of emergency services. He gestured toward her son, still loitering dangerously close to my car, and stated clearly that tampering with another person's vehicle was a criminal offense. Each word was measured, firm, and undeniable. The neighbors murmured louder now, some shaking their heads, others whispering with barely concealed satisfaction. For years they had endured Karen's antics, her endless complaints about lawn decorations, her attempts to dictate what flowers could be planted, her constant surveillance of driveways and mailboxes. Tonight, they witnessed the mask crack. Tonight, she wasn't the enforcer of neighborhood standards. She was the one being called out. Karen's son tried to argue, insisting again that the Mustang should have been his, that it was unfair. But Daniels shut him down with a look, the kind of a authoritative stare that stripped away false confidence. The boy finally backed away from the car, kicking at the pavement, his shoulders hunched. I remained silent, letting the scene unfold, letting Karen stew in the very chaos she had summoned. Because this was not about humiliation, it was about exposure. She had played her hand recklessly, believing her voice and outrage would outweigh reason and authority. Instead, she had revealed herself in front of the very community she sought to control. When Daniels finally turned to me for confirmation of how I wished to proceed, I simply nodded, signaling that a warning was enough for now. There was no need for escalation, at least not yet. The lesson had been delivered, and the neighborhood had witnessed it in full. Karen tried to slink away, dragging her son with her, her face a mix of anger and embarrassment. She muttered about unfair treatment, but the conviction in her words was gone. She crossed the street quickly, retreating into her house, where the blinds snapped shut in record time. The neighbors lingered, exchanging looks, some even chuckling quietly. They knew they had just seen the queen of complaints dethroned, at least for the night. But as I stood there watching the patrol car roll away, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat permanently. She would brood, regroup, and come back with new tactics. Her pride had been wounded, her authority challenged, and in her mind, that required retaliation. The Mustang remained gleaming under the streetlights, untouched but not forgotten. And as the neighborhood slowly returned to quiet, I braced myself for what I knew was coming. Karen wasn't finished. Chapter 3 will uncover how Karen and the HOA escalated their efforts, turning the entire neighborhood into a battlefield over one car, and the chief who refused to bow. The neighborhood might have settled into uneasy quiet that night, but beneath the calm, a new current of tension began to swirl. Karen had retreated, humiliated, yet humiliation rarely subdued her type. For people like her, a public setback wasn't the end. It was fuel. The very next morning, she began working behind closed doors, scheming and rallying support from the one institution she believed still gave her power, the Homeowners Association. The HOA was her arena, her battlefield, her stage. She had been a board member for years, rarely challenged, always loud enough to sway the timid and stubborn enough to outlast dissent. And though many neighbors despised her, few had the stamina to oppose her consistently. She thrived in meetings where she could dictate, criticize, and manipulate the wording of vague community standards. If she couldn't take my Mustang through persuasion or threats, then she would try to bury it under paperwork, fines, and rules twisted to her advantage. It started subtly. Within days, I received my first letter, printed on HOA letterhead and slipped into my mailbox. It claimed that my Mustang, though parked in my driveway, violated aesthetic harmony standards. According to Karen and her allies, it was an unsightly vehicle that diminished the family-friendly appeal of the neighborhood. The irony was glaring. Neighbors drove dented minivans and rusted pickups without issue. But somehow, my meticulously maintained classic car was singled out as a nuisance. I tossed the letter aside. One baseless warning was hardly worth my time. But the HOA wasn't finished. The second letter arrived the following week. This one cited excessive noise disturbances, referencing my occasional Saturday engine tune-ups as though I were hosting drag races in the cul-de-sac. It threatened escalating fines if the disturbances continued. Once again, I ignored it. I knew their playbook. Manufactured complaints, inflated language, empty threats designed to scare homeowners into compliance. But then the third letter came, and this one was different. It demanded that I remove or relocate the vehicle within 30 days or face legal action. The phrasing was sharp, deliberate, and dripping with Karen's fingerprints. She wasn't content with vague warnings anymore. She wanted the Mustang gone, and she had convinced enough board members to sign off on the ultimatum. The neighborhood began to buzz with speculation. On evening walks, people whispered about the feud, trading theories about how it would end. Some quietly approached me, expressing support, rolling their eyes at the absurdity of the HOA's crusade. Others kept their distance, wary of being pulled into the crossfire. After all, everyone knew Karen's reputation for retaliation. Few wanted to make themselves a target. But Karen herself? She grew bolder. I spotted her standing at the edge of her lawn more often, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at her lips as if she were savoring her impending victory. Her son continued to circle like a restless predator, though he no longer dared touch the Mustang directly. Instead, he stared from a distance, his glare simmering with resentment. Behind the scenes, I began documenting everything, every letter, every date, every claim they made, because I knew the HOA's arrogance would eventually lead them to overreach, and when they did, I would be ready. The next HOA board meeting was where the battle lines became visible. The community center was packed that evening, chairs filled with weary residents dragged into the drama. Karen sat at the front, flanked by her loyalists, shuffling papers and speaking in her shrill, authoritative tone. She presented her case against me as though she were prosecuting a criminal, waving photos of my Mustang, citing fabricated complaints from concerned neighbors, and pushing for a motion to have the car permanently removed. Her allies nodded along, some out of fear, others out of apathy. But not everyone stayed silent. A handful of neighbors pushed back, pointing out the hypocrisy question, why my car was being targeted when others clearly violated the same supposed standards. The room became a battlefield of words. Half the voices tired of Karen's tyranny, the other half too intimidated to defy her openly. Through it all, I sat quietly in the back row, observing. I let her rant, let her reveal the full extent of her obsession, because every word she spoke only painted a clearer picture of her vendetta. The meeting stretched long into the evening, tempers flaring, accusations flying. But by the end, Karen had achieved what she wanted. The board voted to uphold their demand. The 30-day clock ticked louder. When the meeting adjourned, Karen strutted from the room like a queen returning from conquest. She met my eyes across the crowd, her smirk daring me to defy her. Her son trailed behind, puffed up with misplaced pride, already envisioning the Mustang as his prize once it was confiscated. The neighbors lingered afterward, whispering among themselves. Some avoided my gaze, unwilling to take sides, but others approached cautiously, offering words of encouragement. They knew Karen had gone too far. They knew this wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. As I walked to the Mustang parked outside, the street lamps casting a soft glow across its polished surface, I ran my hand along the hood and felt the weight of the battle ahead. This wasn't just about a car. It was about standing up to someone who had weaponized power, rules, and fear for too long. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking softly, and started the engine. The Mustang roared to life, its deep growl echoing through the parking lot, a sound that was as much defiance as it was machinery. Heads turned. Some smiled. Some shook their heads nervously. Karen stood near her SUV, glaring, phone already in hand, no doubt planning her next move. But this time, I wasn't simply reacting. I was preparing. The HOA thought they could intimidate me with letters and fines. They had no idea what was coming, because they had forgotten one crucial fact. The man they were trying to push out, the one they thought they could bully into submission, wasn't just another homeowner. He was the chief of police, and I knew exactly how to fight back. The countdown had begun. The days following the HOA meeting carried a strange mix of calm and pressure, like the air before a thunderstorm. On the surface, the neighborhood returned to its usual routines. Sprinklers whirring in the mornings, children riding bikes along the sidewalks, neighbors trimming hedges or washing cars. But beneath that facade, an invisible line had been drawn. On one side stood Karen and her loyalists, armed with the HOA's vote. On the other side stood me, silent but unyielding, with a growing number of quiet supporters who were tired of being pushed around. Karen behaved as if her victory were inevitable. Every time I passed her house, she lingered outside, her smirk plastered in place, her phone always in hand. She whispered loudly to anyone who would listen, exaggerating how the board was finally cleaning up the neighborhood and how that car would be gone in weeks. Her son strutted alongside, bragging to his friends that soon he'd be driving the Mustang down Main Street. Their arrogance was suffocating, but I let them bask in it. I wanted them confident, careless, and blind to the trap they were walking into. My approach was deliberate. Document, prepare, and strike when the time was right. Every letter the HOA sent, I filed neatly in a folder. Every false claim of noise or aesthetic violation, I photographed with time-stamped evidence to prove the opposite. I installed a discreet security camera in the driveway, angled perfectly at the Mustang, capturing not just the car, but anyone who dared approach it. It didn't take long for the camera to pay off. One late afternoon, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, I reviewed the footage. There it was. Karen's son sneaking across the lawn, tugging at the Mustang's door handle again, his frustration clear when it wouldn't budge. He circled the car, muttering to himself, before finally kicking the tire and storming off. Minutes later, Karen appeared, joining him in the driveway, pointing at the car and gesturing animatedly, as if strategizing their next attempt. The footage was more than just proof of trespassing. It was a window into their obsession, a clear record that their claims of me being the aggressor were nothing but projection. I copied the video onto multiple drives, stored it safely, and tucked one into the same growing folder of evidence. But video alone wouldn't be enough. Karen thrived on twisting narratives. If she could spin a 911 call into an accusation of harassment, she could certainly spin trespassing into something else. So, I dug deeper. I began speaking quietly with other neighbors, those who had endured Karen's wrath over the years. It wasn't hard to find stories. The Wilsons recounted how she had once demanded they repaint their fence because the shade of beige clashed with community harmony. The Parkers explained how she had threatened fines for leaving their trash bins out an extra hour. Another neighbor admitted she had been bullied into removing a bird bath from her yard after Karen claimed it attracted pests. Individually, the stories were just petty inconveniences, but collectively, they painted a picture of a pattern, an abuse of power, a neighbor who weaponized the HOA not to preserve community standards, but to enforce her own control. Many residents had remained silent out of exhaustion or fear, but when I asked if they'd be willing to put their complaints in writing, several agreed. They were tired of living under her thumb. Piece by piece, the case grew. Documented harassment, recorded trespassing, written statements from fed-up residents, all woven together into something Karen couldn't dismiss as paranoia or exaggeration. Meanwhile, the HOA's letters escalated. Each one grew sharper, more demanding. The fines piled higher, each notice warning of legal consequences if I refused to comply. But every envelope they stuffed into my mailbox only added weight to my file. With each letter, they weren't just threatening me. They were incriminating themselves. Still, Karen didn't sense the danger. She doubled down, strutting through meetings, spinning her tale of neighborhood improvement. Her son grew bolder too, bragging louder, circling the Mustang more often, though now under the unblinking eye of my camera. The arrogance blinded them to the inevitability of what was coming. By the third week, I had everything I needed. Evidence of targeted harassment, proof of trespassing, documentation of false complaints, written testimonies from neighbors, and, most importantly, the authority to act on it all. I wasn't just a homeowner defending a car. I was the police chief, bound by law, but also empowered by it. I had been patient, deliberate, and thorough. And now, it was time to bring the storm to Karen's doorstep. I filed formal complaints against both Karen and her son, citing harassment, trespassing, and misuse of emergency services. The paperwork went through official channels, no shortcuts, no favoritism. Every I dotted, every T crossed. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of claiming I had abused my position. This would be clean, lawful, and undeniable. When the notices were delivered, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. Karen's shrill voice could be heard down the block, screeching about retaliation and abuse of power, but her words rang hollow. The papers in her hand weren't rumors or gossip. They were legal documents, backed by evidence she couldn't erase. The smug smile vanished. The whispers she once controlled now turned against her. Nay, boars gathered in hushed clusters, sharing the news, their relief almost palpable. For the first time, Karen wasn't untouchable. She wasn't the enforcer. She was the one being held accountable. And as I stood on my porch that evening, watching her storm up and down her driveway, barking at her son and pacing like a caged animal, I knew the battle had shifted. But battles like these never end cleanly. Pride is a dangerous thing, and Karen's pride was already wounded beyond repair. She wouldn't go down quietly. She would fight, claw, and drag anyone she could into her spiral. The storm had broken. But the flood was still coming. Chapter 5 will reveal how Karen's retaliation spiraled out of control, dragging the HOA into chaos and forcing the entire neighborhood to take sides once and for all. Karen had never been one to accept defeat, and now that the papers had been served, her fury reached a level the neighborhood had never witnessed before. What had once been smirks and whispered threats evolved into open hostility. loud enough and brazen enough that even those who had tolerated her antics could no longer ignore them. The morning after the complaints were filed, her blinds snapped open before dawn, and from that moment forward, she was visible at every hour. She paced her driveway, stalked the sidewalks, and glared at my house with the intensity of someone plotting vengeance. Her son shadowed her, sulking and muttering, his obsession with the Mustang simmering like an ember refusing to die out. The retaliation began with the HOA. Karen rallied the board with a fresh wave of urgency, claiming that my complaints were nothing more than intimidation tactics, abuse of power, and an effort to silence a mother protecting her child. She called emergency meetings, sent out mass emails, and plastered the neighborhood forum with long, rambling posts accusing me of everything from corruption to harassment. Her words were venomous, filled with dramatic flourishes meant to spark outrage. At first, a few board members backed her. Some were too entangled in her web of influence to break free, others too timid to confront her directly. But cracks quickly appeared. The evidence I had presented was undeniable. The video of her son trespassing circulated quietly among residents, whispers spreading faster than she could contain them. Her credibility, once inflated by her volume, began to wither under the weight of truth. Still, Karen wasn't ready to let go. She escalated further. Noise complaints were filed against me every other day. Mysterious calls flooded the HOA hotline, all alleging violations supposedly traced to my address. Grass too long, garbage bins out too early, suspicious activity at night. Each claim was laughably false, but the sheer volume created a paper trail she hoped would bury me under administrative pressure. The harassment grew personal, too. One morning, I found my mailbox stuffed with anonymous flyers accusing me of corruption, warning neighbors that their safety was at risk under my watch. Another time, late at night, my security camera caught her son darting across the lawn, hurling an egg at the Mustang before sprinting back into the shadows. The yolk smeared across the hood, sticky and mocking, but the camera captured every frame. Through it all, I remained patient. Every flyer, every baseless complaint, every petty act of vandalism, it all went into the folder. My case, already strong, grew ironclad. But patience didn't come easily. The weight of constant hostility pressed harder each day, and the neighborhood felt it too. Divisions deepened. Some neighbors openly confronted Karen, telling her enough was enough. Others stayed quiet, unwilling to poke the hornet's nest, but silently shifting their sympathies away from her. The street once known for its manicured calm now buzzed with tension. Conversations cut off when she approached. Parents pulled their children inside sooner. The community was fracturing under the pressure of her obsession. The HOA itself teetered on collapse. Half the board grew weary of Karen's antics, frustrated that meetings devolved into screaming matches about my Mustang instead of discussions about landscaping or budgets. The other half clung to her side, whether out of loyalty, fear, or shared pettiness. The organization meant to unite the neighborhood had become a weapon in her vendetta, and in the process, it had begun to rot from the inside. Her breaking point came during one particularly heated board meeting. The room was packed, residents crammed into folding chairs, the air heavy with anticipation. Karen stormed in with a stack of papers, her son trailing behind with his ever-present scowl. She launched into a tirade, waving documents, accusing me of crimes that had no basis in reality. She demanded that the board file a lawsuit, that my Mustang be impounded, that I be stripped of any standing within the neighborhood. Her voice rose higher and higher, shriller with every word. Spit flew as she shouted, veins bulging in her neck, her arms slicing through the air. But for the first time, the room didn't bend to her will. The neighbors didn't nod. They didn't murmur approval. They sat stiff and silent, their eyes wide, not with agreement, but with disbelief. Finally, one resident, A soft-spoken woman from 3 houses down stood up and asked the question that hung in the air like smoke. "Why are you so obsessed with that car?" The room erupted. Others joined in, voices overlapping, frustrations spilling out. They accused Karen of wasting everyone's time, of turning the HOA into her personal battleground. They pointed out the egging, the false complaints, the endless letters. One man flatly stated that he had proof Karen herself was behind half the anonymous calls. The tide turned, swift and brutal. Karen's face contorted, rage and desperation twisting together. She shouted back, denying everything, accusing the entire room of conspiring against her. But the more she screamed, the clearer the truth became. Her authority was gone. Her power, once fueled by fear and volume, had burned itself out in front of everyone. By the end of the meeting, the board was in shambles. Several members resigned on the spot, unwilling to be part of the circus any longer. Others called for an emergency vote to strip Karen of her position entirely. Her son sat in the corner, red-faced and silent, his fantasies of the Mustang dissolving into nothing. Karen stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The silence she left behind was deafening, heavy with relief but also with uncertainty. What would she do next? Would this be the end of her crusade, or the spark that lit something even worse? That night, as I sat on my porch, the Mustang gleaming beside me, I thought about the path we had traveled. What began as a boy's entitled demand had spiraled into a war that consumed an entire neighborhood. And though Karen's empire was crumbling, I knew her pride wouldn't let her vanish quietly. The storm wasn't over. It was reaching its climax. After the board meeting imploded, the neighborhood hung in a strange limbo. For years, Karen had been the self-appointed ruler of our cul-de-sac, her voice loud enough and sharp enough to slice through anyone's peace. But now her grip was broken. The HOA, once her weapon, was fractured and bleeding members. Neighbors who had cowered under her scrutiny were finally speaking openly. And yet, despite her public humiliation, Karen wasn't finished. Pride rarely lets people like her walk away. Instead, it drives them to reckless extremes. And in her desperation, Karen made the one move that ensured her downfall. It happened 2 weeks after the disastrous meeting. The evening was calm, the sky streaked with lavender and orange as the sun dipped low. I was inside finishing dinner when the shrill blare of my Mustang's alarm shattered the quiet. I bolted outside, and there it was, Karen's son, once again, standing beside my car. Only this time, it wasn't just a tug at the handle or an egg hurled in frustration. This time, he held a crowbar. The Mustang's side mirror dangled loose, the paint scratched deep where he had struck it. He raised the crowbar again, his face twisted with rage and entitlement. But before he could land another blow, the floodlights snapped on, and the security camera above my garage whirred, capturing everything. Karen stood at the edge of the driveway, her voice cutting through the night like a siren. She wasn't stopping him. She was egging him on, shouting that this is what happens when selfish people don't share. Her arms waved, her fury spilling out unchecked, a desperate attempt to reclaim power through destruction. Neighbors poured onto their lawns, gasps and whispers spreading as they watched the spectacle. Phones rose into the air, recording every second. The queen of the HOA, the enforcer of community harmony, stood screaming in the street while her son vandalized private property. I didn't move immediately. I didn't have to. Because within minutes, the familiar wail of sirens pierced the night. This time it wasn't Karen who had made the call. It was half the neighborhood. 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing, doors swinging open. Officers Daniels and Ramirez stepped out, their faces a blend of disbelief and grim determination. They had been here before, listening to Karen's endless accusations. But tonight was different. Tonight, the evidence was undeniable. Karen shrieked as they approached, her voice frantic, claiming that I had provoked her son, that the Mustang was an eyesore, that the community had demanded action. But the officers ignored her rambling. Their eyes locked on the crowbar, still clutched in her son's trembling hands, the damage to the Mustang glaring under the floodlights. Daniels ordered him to drop the weapon. The boy hesitated, his bravado collapsing in the face of real authority. When the crowbar clanged against the pavement, the last of his entitlement seemed to drain away. Ramirez moved swiftly, handcuffing him as Karen screamed louder, her words dissolving into incoherence. She lunged toward the officers, demanding they stop, insisting they arrest me instead. But Daniel stepped between us, his patience finally gone. He warned her sharply to back away. She froze, shocked by the tone, unaccustomed to resistance. The neighbors, gathered on sidewalks and porches, stood in stunned silence. For years, she had wielded power unchecked. Now she was watching it evaporate under the weight of her own actions. The officers worked methodically. Photos of the damage were taken, statements from witnesses collected, and, most importantly, the security camera footage was downloaded directly on the spot, irrefutable evidence of the crime. Karen's son was led into the patrol car, his face pale, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. Karen herself was spared cuffs that night, but not consequence. She was cited for inciting vandalism and disorderly conduct, her shrieks echoing as the officers read the charges. The neighborhood didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They simply stood in silence, the weight of years of conflict pressing down all at once. For many, it was the first time they had seen true accountability reach the woman who had tormented them for so long. And though no one said it aloud, the relief in their faces spoke louder than words. When the patrol cars pulled away, the street felt lighter, as though a storm had finally passed. Karen stumbled back to her house, her voice hoarse, her posture broken. She slammed the door behind her, but this time there was no power in it, only defeat. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. The HOA, already fractured, collapsed entirely. With half the board resigned and the other half distancing themselves from Karen, the organization disbanded. Letters of apology circulated, some neighbors admitting they had only ever gone along with Karen out of fear. Others offered to help repair the Mustang, their gratitude for standing up to her spilling over in small gestures of kindness. Karen and her son grew quiet. The once constant stream of complaints, the endless lectures about community standards, vanished. Her blinds stayed closed, her driveway remained empty. The whispers suggested she was considering moving, that the humiliation was too much to bear. Whether or not that was true, the silence itself was victory enough. As for the Mustang, I had it repaired quickly, restoring it to the same polished glory it had always been. Every time I slid behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life, it was more than just the sound of horsepower. It was the sound of resilience, of standing firm when entitlement tried to bulldoze reason. The neighborhood healed slowly. Without Karen's iron grip, it began to breathe again. Barbecues returned to driveways, children laughed freely in the cul-de-sacs, and neighbors waved without suspicion. The shadow she had cast for so long lifted, revealing a community finally at peace. Looking back, it was almost absurd that everything had started with a boy demanding a car that wasn't his. But in neighborhoods like ours, where control and pride collide, small sparks often ignite the fiercest fires. Karen had believed volume was power, that rules could be twisted to her will, that fear could keep people quiet. But in the end, she had forgotten the one truth that always surfaces. Entitlement may roar loudly, but it collapses when faced with accountability. And so, the story of the Mustang ended not with a transfer of keys, but with justice served. The car stayed exactly where it belonged. The neighborhood finally moved forward, and Karen, the woman who once ruled the HOA like a tyrant, was left only with silence.